Okay. Okay, it works. All right. Thank you, computer god. Yes, so just a few quick words about me. Like Mike mentioned, my research sits at the intersection between science communication, visual communication, as well as race communication. So especially during the past few years, I've been studying how visual representations from data visualizations, photos, illustrations, all the way to AI-generated images change public understanding of science, trust, as well as race perception. So today, I want to first talk about how visuals matter in science communication. Even though visuals have been used so widely across many different scientific disciplines, surprisingly and unfortunately, they haven't been like really thoroughly studied in the field of science communication yet. So I do want to really talk about why visuals matter, what are some of the recent changes that we have seen, and more importantly, what is the new challenges that's brought by these newer emerging forms of media, for example, AI, right? So how it caused this visual trust crisis to the way how we communicate science and portray science in many scenarios. And following that, I do want to introduce more specifically about this community-based project that I collaborated with Brad, Victoria, who's in the room, and a few other LSC students regarding ice safety among the Great Lakes area. So it's a case study that combines research and practice and design, so you can see how everything goes together to inform local community members' perception of risk in the climate change context. So first of all, why visuals matter in science communication? So I feel like something that you guys may have experienced in your life is these days, we heavily rely on visual forms for communication, right? So how many of you use TikTok on a regular basis? Some of you, Instagram, yes. Yes, so visuals do dominate our news consumption and information intake in many cases, and especially when you think about science communication. This is an example that several years ago really drew my interest in this area. It's a climate change visualization that's called Show Your Stripes. I don't know how many of you have heard about this. So this is a visualization of climate change data. So what this graph shows is over the hundreds of years, like centuries, what is the change in the temperature globally. And the cool thing about this graph is you can actually customize the visualizations. So it has an online website. What you can do is you can put in your zip code. You can see, like, for example, how the changes in the temperature happen to your local area. And more importantly, it somehow simplifies the data, because instead of using data points or line charts to represent the change, it uses color codings. So from blue or darker blue all the way to lighter red, orange to like darker red, it indicates this very visible, discernible warming trend that otherwise wouldn't be very visible if you just look at data trends or looking into a table. So in many cases, I feel like these charts and very innovative ways of visualizations have been increasingly used to engage with the public, right? So to bring public awareness to different scientific, environmental issues, and more importantly, to really, encourage actions. And for example, for the Show Your Stripes, every year in June, there is a Show Your Stripe Day that used to happen on Twitter, now X, but I don't know if it's still happening these days because there's so much changes to that platform. But the goal is really to bring awareness and encourage people to post their local stripes and to create this community where people can use basically a visual icon to communicate and establish this shared identity among themselves as people who are concerned and cared about their local environmental changes. So examples like this, I think, really demonstrate the power in visuals when it comes to science and environmental communication. It simplifies the complexity imagery that usually is very hard to digest for lay audiences, and it makes the invisible visible, right? So I think these days, if you think about environmental issues, very few of us actually directly experience them, right? I mean, if you live in California, yes, you may see the fires, or live here, you may see like a few extreme weather events, but most often we do rely on these visuals to kind of get a tangible sense about what's going on. So that's another power, kind of persuasive powers of visuals that really bring the invisible phenomena into more visible patterns. And lastly, from a communication perspective, it definitely captures attention. For example, the stripes here, it originates from like an online movement. Basically, people show pictures on social media platforms, but over the time, they paint it everywhere. They paint it on the road, on people's masks during COVID-19, and they even project a giant stripes on some of the famous like landmarks in the UK and in some parts of Europe. So it really becomes a powerful tool to capture people's attention and make that idea stick in people's mind. And more importantly, I think from science communication, it's really important to use visuals to not just convey the issue and bring awareness, but really to cultivate people's trust and perceived credibility in science, as well in how scientists do their work, meaning the procedural process, credibility of that is equally important. And so in the history, I'm sure you guys have seen maybe some of these pictures that I have up on the screen. The first one is, one of the most recent Hubble telescope images published by NASA several years ago. So the goal is not just to bring people's awareness of these new space research, right? Yes, it's important to show people what's going on, but more importantly, to really create that brand, right? To really use this more like a marketing tool for NASA to establish its legitimacy, as well as to secure a lot of these larger investments that they have in these scientific equipment. And the other picture is one of the original pictures of DNA that's created by the scientist Francis Crick and James Watson back in 1950s. So the DNA, as you guys can see, is not something that you can observe using your own eyes, right? So showing a picture that demonstrates scientific, theories, as well as the models, these simulations really manifest what scientists have been imagining, has discovered, is really important. So in those cases, these images really serve as evidence. That tells something that's real and make people feel like scientists know something, right? So a lot of researchers have concluded that the main function of science visuals is really to convey a sense of knowing, which is really, really important, especially during situations like COVID-19, where nobody knows what's going on. When you don't know what is at stake, you cannot really see the pathogens that cause everything. Showing a picture doesn't just let people know there is a disease or there is a virus. It actually conveys the authority of scientists by saying we know what it looks like. So it's really important. And for those images, like the aesthetics, right? So all of these pictures kind of use this beauty, sense of awe to further enhance that perception of scientific authority and almost become a heuristic for people to judge whether something is credible, when it's shown as visuals. So however, I would say the conventional visual science communication, they do fall short. For example, most of these efforts heavily rely on the established visual language of science. So scientists talk to each other using visuals, right? So whether it's data charts, whether it's maps, whether it's the protein models, whether it's simulations, a lot of these visuals do have their own visual grammar. So for example, when you have a data visualization, you do need a title, you do need legend, you do need scales to complete the visual language itself. And that visual language has been used kind of just transferred into public sphere as well when they're used for public communication purposes. And second of all, because of that, the interpretation and understanding of these visuals usually require relatively high level of visual graph and or data literacy, right? So you have to be able to know how to interpret a data graph. You have to know, oh, these lines indicate that, or the lenses mean that, or this and that. So it usually requires not just people's understanding of the issue itself. It requires a type of literacy that not every single American has, even when they're adults. And because of that, sometimes these graphs can be subject to misinterpretation. And what I have here is a very popular example during COVID-19. Does anybody still remember this? Right? Yeah, any recall? So this is a flattened curve chart, if you guys recall, right? So back in 2020, early 2020, I remember it was February. At that time, nobody knew what was going on, right? So scientists and epidemiologists were talking about how important it is to, keep social distancing, to wear a mask, to make sure that we're doing these prevention measures so the pandemic can be under control, right? So basically, the idea is if everybody does its own thing, if we're protecting ourselves and protecting each other, the hospital should be running better, right? So we want to save beds for those who need it. And so that is the gist of the flattened curve chart. I hope I have a little laser, but basically the one that's on the right on your side, that red versus blue curves, that was the initial flattened curve graph that was posted on Twitter at that time by Drew Harris, who is a population health scientist at Thomas Jefferson University. So the process of creating it and making it such a viral thing on social media was quite fascinating, because what he shared via this New York Times article was that he was on a plane. So he was on a plane, looking at all of these news information about COVID, and he noticed something that was published on The Economist, which is the graph in the middle, that talks about this idea of community mitigation of infectious diseases. And he thought it was great. He thought it's something that definitely echoed with him. He have seen the similar models before. So he quickly drew something on the back of a napkin. And when he got home, he posted this on his own Twitter. Okay, so that is the thing that everybody saw. And after that one was posted, it became so viral. I remember seeing something and hearing people talk about it in my personal networks during that time too. However, this chart, it was actually all the way was from the CDC report that is the far left. Okay, so this left graph was the very, very original copy of flattened curve. It has nothing to do with COVID. It just talk about how mitigation of infectious diseases should happen at a community level. So it's just a very scientific concept and model. And for this original graph, what it tries to convey is actually three things. Okay, so if you do all these mitigation measures, first of all, you're going to prolong the peak, right? So that's number one, if you see a one on the top of the arrow. And second of all, you're going to reduce the numbers of infected people, okay? So that's number two. That means the curve has been flattened. And another thing that you may notice is the purple curve is much larger. If you see the area, it's much larger than the flattened curve. Does that make sense, people? So just the area, right? The area underneath the curve for the purple one compared to the transparent one. That means you should have much fewer people that were infected and got sick. And the third one is just the pandemic. With dimensions to diminish the overall cases and health impact, right? So it's 1, 2, 3. If you do that thing, three things will happen. However, there's a very key information that got missed for the middle chart. It talks about this, delay effect. It talks about this reduced peak. However, if you see that the areas, the curves are no longer visibly different from each other. So it no longer talk about how the number of infected cases would be reduced. if you do everything correctly. Does that make sense? So I think this is, I don't know how it happens, but it somehow just got mistranslated by the news media. And then when Drew Harris posted it, he kind of just copied what he saw from the magazine without actually correcting that. So how does this type of information influence people? I think it is like a fantastic idea for using visuals during such a health emergency and inform people about their decisions. But as you can see, because it has this misrepresentation, I think at that time, it does create some misconceptions saying that, even if you do these measures, you won't necessarily save more people's lives, as indicated by the two equal size curves. But if you go back to the original science concept, it's not what it meant to say, okay? And I think this is can happen frequently because in many cases, visuals are more open to interpretations. So, the misinterpretation could result from either the misrepresentation or the lack of contextual information, which is happening in this case. And also, I think, in these days, because of the AI, especially the, invention and quick, advancement of the AI-generated image technology, I think there's huge, there's, going to be significant changes to the way how science visuals are evaluated. In the old days, when you think about these science visuals, I kind of talk about how they usually look, how they usually work for different audiences. So the typical cues that individuals use to judge the credibility of science visuals usually include the epistemic structures, right? So if you see something that looks like a scientific graph, if you see something that has data points, has lines, looks like a pie chart, there has been a lot of research that shows people automatically attach more credibility to it because this is something, it looks like something that's generated by scientists. And the second cue that people usually rely on is aesthetic cues. So if it's aesthetically sophisticated, it uses a lot of aesthetic patterns that emerge in science visuals. For example, clear lines, those artificial kind of colors, very special color schemes. A lot of those visual appearance cues do influence the way people judge credibility, and some other factors include people's knowledge, their visual literacy, as well as how familiar they are with the topic, and etc. But in the AI era, as you guys can imagine, those cues, especially the visual appearance cues, are no longer be valid, right? Because these days it's possible for everybody to make any kind of beautiful, appealing, scientific-looking image just within seconds if you put a simple text in ChatGPT or something else, DALL-E, etc. So this example was shared actually last semester by one of the speakers for this series, MIT scientist Felice Frankel, who is one of the best science photographers in the field, and she was talking about the same issue because she has been working in this field forever, and the picture on the left was her original work, kind of just photographing how nano materials look in the lab, and she used colors. She used these little bottles to show the material. However, when she put kind of similar prompts in the DALL-E at the moment, and this is what is generated, right? So if you know nothing about nanomaterials, if you're just generally interested in this topic, when you look at these two images, can you actually judge which one is more credible, right? So maybe you can sort of tell, yeah, the other one looks a little AI generated, but just from aesthetics perspectives, especially for people who are not necessarily familiar or know how AI images work, they may not be able to tell the credibility in this case. So another thing is because of the AI's implications, science has now seen bigger issues with its visual misconduct. So I'm sure you guys all know that science, especially for the areas that heavily rely on visual science data, like biology, life sciences, material science, engineering, engineering, et cetera, what happens to those disciplines these days is they have a huge crisis with their visual data. This is one of the examples that happened in 2024, I believe, which is quite interesting because, this image of a mouse and, whatever that's there, right? So that's, it got it's obviously AI generated. You don't really need to be an expert in this area to see that's completely distorted. However, it passed peer review process. It passed the editorial process. It got really published, eventually published on a peer-reviewed journal. But later on, because people have seen this, it caused a huge outcry on social media and et cetera. A lot of science illustrators as well as researchers in this area were really outraged by this incident, and the paper got retracted just because they misused the visuals, but it's not going to be the single case where people start doing more of that, but maybe in a more careful way. And the second example was from nanomaterial science. This is the article that was actually published by a group of researchers in that discipline. So what is shown here is the top row are real data. So those are real material science images. And the one on the bottom are fake ones. Can you guys even tell the difference? Sort of, right? If I tell you which one is real, which one is fake, yes, you're probably, yeah, the second one, the edges are blurry or whatever, right? So you might be able to tell some of the differences. However, based on the conclusions of this paper, even experts, even scientists in this discipline, they did a survey for these people. They weren't able to discern the differences. They don't know which one is real, which one is fake. So it really caused more problems within the science discipline. So within this new landscape, how do audiences determine whether to trust scientific issues, especially when it's attributed to AI as its generation source? And so this is a paper that we published last year, and Dominique is one of the co-authors on this piece as well, and Diane and Shah and Lindsay. So what we did for this experiment is we use AI. So we use Face AI, one of the tools that we feel really allow us to create visuals in a more noised way. So it allows you to edit after it's created. It has this canvas tool that's quite handy. So we chose to do that. And then the topic that we're studying is CRISPR. So CRISPR as a gene editing tool that allows you to precisely edit genes for crops. So for the context, we just talk about how CRISPR can be, either an innovative way or a natural way or technological way to improve crops in the agricultural context. So it's a rather neutral topic because we don't want to use something that people have strong opinions about already. And for the images, we use tomatoes as sort of a metaphorical representations. Because tomatoes are actually the first commercially made commercial products that's made by CRISPR, and it's available in the market. So it's sort of a very popular reference point that mass media, we did content analysis of newspapers and et cetera. So it's very popular, for the visual representations of CRISPR. So it's kind of just ensure that external validity there. And for the experiment, we have 9 conditions total. So for some of these, we do have the AI disclaimers. It's a little bit hard to see, but actually the middle line was the 3 images that has a little label there that says it's images generated by AI. And then for the first row, we didn't say anything. The top. Yes, the top row was the one with the AI disclaimers. The middle row was the pictures with no disclaimers. And as control, we also have those textual, conditions that has the same title, same captions. Everything is, created as of an Instagram post. So we ask people how they perceive the credibility of information, and we recruited people through online panels, and this is a random experiment. So what we have found, now it's doing this to me again. Okay, so what we have found is when people evaluate the credibility of these different visuals, what matters more is, first of all, whether they see the labels, whether you have the labels on the pictures, and second of all, is whether people are familiar with the AI technology. So overall, when you compare the 9 different conditions, we didn't really detect the main effect of our treatment, meaning that whenever that condition you're in, the average, the mean of people's credibility reading wasn't that much different or wasn't significantly different. However, if you break them down by their familiarity level with AI, all of a sudden you see these very interesting patterns where those who are more familiar with AI perceive the labeled content to be more credible. Does that make sense to people? So for those people, the study was done, the data was collected in 2024, so it was still like a time where AI-generated image was kind of like a relatively new thing. So our assumption for that was that during that time, having these labels, having these source attributions still serve as a transparency cue, still serve as something that indicate well-intentions, especially for those who are familiar with this technology at that point. And so for those who are not familiar with AI, as you can see, like adding that labels doesn't really change the way how they perceive the credibility. And another thing, we didn't find any interactions for people's self-reported detection skills, because in the survey we also asked people, do you think you're good at detecting AIs, and etc. So we assume maybe, if you think you're good at doing this, if you see something is AI generated, maybe you will say it's not credible, but we didn't find anything like that. What mattered more is your understanding of the technology itself and eventually how you perceive these different labels, not necessarily just as a source cues, but as a gesture of transparency. That's what we have found. So what does this all mean, right? So this line of research, I think, first of all, tells us that visuals help shape meaning and raise perception. So this is another study that I did during COVID. It's like to study how visual representations of the COVID virus change people's fear toward the disease, as well as yes, just their fear. Yeah, their fear and risk perception. Yeah, fear and risk perception of the disease. So what we have found is people really rely on these different appearance visuals to develop emotions toward this disease, okay? So again, this is like early COVID stage. So what we have found when looking at some of these images with more dramatic looking, especially the ones that has a lot of dots on them, a lot of highly contrasting colors, a lot of green, gooey, red, kind of people that definitely increase people's level of disgust as well as fear. And some of these other visuals that are more plain, just black and white, doesn't really cause that strong emotional reactions. And further, because of that emotional reactions, some people do feel having more higher level of perceived risk when they think about COVID right after they see these images. And second of all, audiences' existing beliefs and perceptions determine their interpretation. I think, as communication scholars and researchers, I think, focus on your audiences, right? So your audiences already know about this topic. Their existing, visual literacies, their existing knowledge about these newer type of technologies can be used to make visuals is really important because they play a larger role in determining the interpretations in many cases. And traditional credibility cues, the ones that scientists and science disciplines have heavily relied on, the optimistic ones as well as the aesthetics ones, are not going to be enough for the AI era. First of all, those cues, especially the source cues, right? So those would be the third one. So the source cues can be easily disregarded or dismissed in the online environment. When you quickly scroll something, you aren't going to be paying attention to see which source this particular graph is coming from, especially if it's small and just part of a TikTok post or Instagram post or something. And second of all, because of AI, those epistemic as well as aesthetic cues can be very easily replicated. And what happens to people is you will no longer rely on the appearance of a visuals to judge its credibility. You will increasingly rely on, for example, whether this visual confirms something you already know, or whether this visual confirms something that you already believe. So I haven't got any empirical data on that. It's going to be probably in my next project, but I can share some anecdotal experiences, right? So when my students, for example, see something that doesn't really confirm what they know, they will say that's probably AI generated. That's probably something that's not real. So in the past, it's hard to say so because it's such high barriers for anybody to generate scientific-looking visuals. When it's no longer the case, it's so easy for people to say, it's AI generated. I'm not going to trust it, no matter how beautiful or trustworthy it looks. Okay, so that's another point there. And I think in this case, context also matters. Visuals are never interpreted alone. So I think it's really important for viewers and individuals to understand how to interpret this, right? So thinking about the flattened curve chart, what should I look at? What do these areas mean? Does that mean necessarily something that I think is true? It's a communicator's job to kind of provide a context to promote understanding and make sure that understanding is accurate. And transparency about visual production will become increasingly important, again, all because of AI, and showing that will actually builds higher level of trust. And it's not just about, showing where that visual come from. It's really about, how did you construct this visual? So for example, for the NASA images, I've seen some earlier research which is quite interesting that just, ask people whether, how they interpret the space visuals. And a lot of people would say, oh, that's really beautiful. I never thought that space would be so colorful. Actually, space is not colorful. When you're out there, I think it's going to be very dark and you won't be able to see anything like what is shown in the picture. But institutions and scientists never actually put into serious efforts into explaining how these visuals are made. Why do we need to see these beautiful trends, patterns? What data that we can get out of it, without actually causing some misunderstanding about audiences. So last of all, I want to talk about this case study that we did during the past 2 years. This is a community-based project. I collaborated with Professor Brett Shaw in our department, who also affiliated with Extension as an environmental specialist. And again, Victoria and some of the other LSC students were involved, and so does Lexi Guzman from Nelson Institute. So this project is about ice safety. So I don't know how many of you do ice fishing. Do we have ice fishing people here? Yeah, some of you. Yeah, so where do you guys fish? Where do you fish?
I'm from a very small town in Wisconsin, so any lake that has fish in it.
Yes. Yeah. What about you, Libby?
University Bay.
Okay, yeah. So ice fishing is a very popular, Katie is here today. Yeah, so Katie was part of this as well. Yeah, so ice fishing is, a very well-established tradition in many parts of Wisconsin and other parts of the U.S. as well, especially, on Great Lakes. This is such a unique and special activity. During the winters, I was there in late January. I was amazed by how big this activity is. So when you get on the Sturgeon Bay, there was literally a village built there. There are these small ice shacks that were built by these different guys, and it's 3 miles away from the shore, and people stay there just for fishing these giant white fishes that are only available in the Great Lakes area during the winter. So it's very unique. It's culturally unique. It brings a lot of economical benefits to the area. There's a whole industry that depends on it. However, in recent years, what we have seen is the ice conditions have become more and more unstable. So first of all, because the winters are getting warmer, especially during the past 2 years, not necessarily this year, but past 2 years, we have seen like almost no ice season. So for example, for us, we planned on going out there last year, but we weren't able to because it was just warm. You know, the season was extremely short. The guide wasn't able to take us anywhere. And another thing that we have seen, which is kind of special, is because you have these like more sudden and more extreme temperature change during the winter, the ice become like less stable. So it becomes less predictable. And what happens is no longer just like, oh, you step on the ice, it cracks, you fall in the water, you drown. What happens more is when you get that far on the ice, all of a sudden it may break away from the shore. So when you have these larger ice flows that just kind of all of a sudden flow away from the shore, and some of the news, for example, this one and the other ones that I found from the Green Bay area, there could be as large as of a group of like 20 to 30 people got stuck on these ice flows and not able to get back. So what happened in those situations is, helicopters are going to be sent, people are going to be rescued. Everybody is fine, nobody died or got injured. However, they're going to lose their equipment. If there's a vehicle or something, they won't be able to bring that back. And on top of that, a helicopter rescue costs like up to $60,000 per rescue. So it's a really heavy burden for the local government as well. It's just like getting worse. And this type of risk is kind of new because, we used to have like colder weathers, and it was not like as unpredictable as this. So a lot of people, like including the most experienced ice anglers, are not really aware or knowledgeable about this newer type of risk that they're facing. However, like when you think about ice safety, like how these issues were communicated, it was really outdated. So if you Google it, this is probably the only type of safety charts that you're going to be finding on the internet that is widely used by a lot of institutions and agencies like DNRs, Wisconsin DNR, Minnesota DNR, etc. So what it says is like, just use these like heuristic cues, right? So if you see a man on the ice standing well, that probably means there is at least 4 inches of ice underneath. And if you see a snowmobile or trucks or whatever, it means that the ice is quite stable, it's quite thick, and you're fine when you see those things on the ice. It's not going to be true anymore, right? In these days, because of all these changes and unpredictable ice conditions, even if you see a truck, it doesn't mean it's safe. You see a truck today, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to drive truck on the same ice tomorrow. So that is outdated, that is misleading. If you still use this type of information, you're not going to be protecting people. And another way of seeing the ice, this is a picture that I took during my field trip, is you can see these ice ridges. Does that make sense? So it's like these huge ice bumps that stick on top of these, lake surfaces. And my fish guide told me that this is the worst year that they have ever seen this, because on Great Lakes, it used to be flat. Like you can just like walk on it, drive on it, it's fine. However, because of these ice ridges, like it becomes so bumpy, and it's hard for people to like maneuver, and it's like, just worse. Things are changing. Things are definitely changing. A lot of people that I spoke to, they don't know what exactly going on, but they will share with you things are different from when they were little when it comes to this activity. And so for our research, this is a 2-year funded project by Wisconsin Sea Grant. We really combine research and practice. So first of all, we want to enhance the safety education, right? So we want people to really be more aware of this newer type of risk and really enhance their safety measures. But at the same time, we also want to know, like, what's going on? Like, do people actually know? Do people actually care? What are some of the risks that they are more concerned about? So we started it with an in-depth interview with 14 Green Bay anglers. So this is like a really hour-long engaged conversations, and we try to reach to like female, male, experienced, or people who are like, fishing for a shorter period of time to really get diverse perspectives into this activity, what they think is risky, what they think is changing, what vehicles do they use, do they feel like, the risk has been increased. It's a really in-depth interview that allows us to develop a survey that we filled with 350 Great Lakes anglers, mostly recruited from the western Great Lakes states. So that includes Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, Illinois, and I'm trying to think, there should be one more. And those states, those people allow us to gauge the existing risk perceptions, right? So if people think it's risky to do ice fishing, what type of risks that they're most concerned about, whether it's drowning, whether it's falling to the ice with their vehicle, whether it's, these bigger flows, like, are you aware of that? Are you concerned about that? Or there is something else. And trusted source, right? So what are the sources that they trust? Whether it's interpersonal communication, Facebook, online group, etc., DNR, as well as what are the things that they currently do to remain safe on the ice. So it's a rather comprehensive survey. We're still working on publishing the results, but I can quickly share with you 2 takeaways. First of all, ice anglers are a very interesting group because based on our survey, almost everybody say that they are very confident in their own abilities of staying safe on the ice. Guess how many people have confidence in others? Anybody give me a number? If everybody's here thinking, I'm pretty good at this, I'm pretty good at science communication, who do you think everybody else is good at science communication? 40%. Okay, so 40% think like others are confident in others' abilities to stay safe. So this is really optimistic bias, right? So things are going to happen to them, not myself. And another thing is very few people actually acknowledge these neurotype risks. They do think things are changing, but very few people know that. So that's why for our approach, we just carry out a mini campaign under this name, Know Your Ice, Know Your Odds. So we want to use more of an advocacy and positive framing because of this optimistic bias, right? So we talk about, for example, showing pictures of people like got stuck on the ice or, not be able to like retrieve their equipment, this and that. But, given these audiences, we don't think that's going to work. People are going to be like, that's for dear John next door, it's not going to be for me. So that's why we enhance this confidence further. And another thing that's quite common for this community is it's quite like closely tied community. So we use a lot of peer-based messages. So we were like, stay tied, from one angler to another. So kind of, elevate that, peer connections. Because if you look on Facebook and et cetera, they do have very close communities where they share information, et cetera. So for a specific message, we came up with 3 points. The first one is drill smart. Second one is watch the wind. The last one is trust data. The drill smart, why we want to do that is because we found in our survey there's only significant correlations between people's drilling actions and their perceived risk of climate change. So the more often that people drill, like before they actually start fishing, which is something that they actually have to do like every time they fish, the more likely that they think it's risky. So we think it's probably because that first-hand experience, right? So when you see the slushy ice, when you see like the ice changes every day, you probably be like, yeah, things are not as good as before. So that's why we encourage people to drill smart, drill often, and watch the wind is more related to the ice flows, especially on the Green Bay area. If it's south, like strong south wind, there is a higher chance for people to get stuck. And trust data is we do encourage people to not build their judgment just on the guesses or experiences, to really refer to the data. And because the project was funded by NOAA, we do want people to use more of their resources and stuff. And this logo was designed by our design partners, the Measure Incorporate. And this project, during this design process, we also consult extension specialists, designers, community partners to really develop and disseminate these research-informed materials. So here are just like a few examples. I'm just going to go through them relatively fast because I do want to save some time for Q&A. So the one on the left is our major magazine ad. So there is an ice fishing magazine in Wisconsin that's published by the Deer and Haunting magazine group. But it turns out not to be a very good choice because even though that is the only ice fishing magazine in the state, later, like when I spoke with my fish guide, he was like, nobody read that one, you know, like it was not something that was very popular in our field. But anyhow, we used the outlet to create our, anchor piece, right? So it has our logo, it has our main messages, drill smart, drill often, watch the wind, trust data, not luck, and from one angler to another, tight lines and stay safe. Really use the language to engage them. And for the visual part, we keep it very minimal, just use the auger because that's our primary message. We do want people to, really drill often and see that changes themselves. And for the safety card, we can replicate our main messages and visual identity and everything. And for the safety part, we still use the same kind of idea, like you have to use these inches and etc. like when you actually drill, but we no longer show those like misleading heuristics that may cause like misunderstanding. And this is a animation that we created. I'm just going to show it very fast. It's only like a 30-second. Okay, so this one, as you guys can see, like we did show like a data graph, right? So we did show like the changes in ice covers and everything, but we didn't really rely on that one as our main message. So my goal for that one is to use that to establish that scientific credibility, right? And also avoid really talking about climate change because ice anglers in Wisconsin, as you guys are imagining, are not going to be 100% receptive of this idea. So we focus on like ice cover change, Great Lakes, to use that visual to draw attention, to build that memory, to really hit the point to the message. But at the same time, we try to provide context, right? We try to like enhance that visual with all these tips and points that echoes the themes of our major campaign. Oops. And so the last point is the one that we're currently developing, hopefully in the collaboration with researchers in luminology and climate research, is to really develop a ice safety map to really show, like for example, where the accidents happen. And for this study, it's part of our survey. So what we want to see is, in addition to the map, like to actually show the locations of the ice accidents to provide more information. What else can we do, right? So as communication, researchers were thinking about like adding context, adding more narratives to each data point to actually show what's going on, right? So instead of just saying so-and-so got injured, so-and-so died, we actually describe what happened to their vehicle, what happened to their equipment, etc. So that provides that little story. And then on the side, we also include efficacy information. It's like what you can do. So it's a 2x2 experiment. And what we have found is for this type of map that integrates the basic information as well as narratives and efficacy information are most positively received by those who are already very concerned about this type of risk. So for those who are not very concerned about the risk, obviously nothing works. It doesn't really generate a difference because they don't really care. They are not gonna read everything into more details anyhow. So moving forward, I'm just gonna wrap up really quickly. I think, as researchers, as practitioners, and as, audiences who are interested in this topic, we do need to know more and understand how visual trust develops in an AI-mediated information environment, right? So what are the actual cues, especially for the visual themselves, right? So what are these actual visual
visual characteristics, for example, realism, or maybe the sophisticated patterns, or maybe some like AI artifacts, as you know, those weird things that you've seen, are those things actually determine the way how we see visuals in this new era. I think it's going to be like a big change to the way how we talk and show science to different audiences. And second of all, how these features shape people's perception, interpretation, and especially how they interpret uncertainty in different scenarios. And last of all, how can we use this to drive meaningful action and large-scale behavioral change? And again, just shout out to my amazing team there, who actually did like a very fabulous outreach programs at the Wisconsin Ice Fishing Expo last year. And so thank you everyone for your attention.